Okay, so we're gonna do a test. These are the T series, and they are meant to be the thinnest speakers. They're about, I'd say about an inch and a third thick. So that means, and they're actually really solid if you want to see them. The case to them would say that inside there's probably about less than an inch to work with as far as depth. The tweeter in these things are huge. See it? That's the waveguide to the tweeter. I believe the tweeter is 1.25 inches. That's the woofer right there. The woofer is based off of the 3000 series woofer, which was prototyped and then slimmed down using the rear blades to actually hold the magnets, which is actually pretty clever. But what's interesting is, for as little space they had as far as the depth, they actually sunk in everything a good inch. And that's so that there's this waveguide that goes around the woofer, and obviously the tweeter has a tangerine waveguide on it with very, very deep 2001 series style, very, very thick, I don't know how to call them, not thick, very deep fins, or tangerines, I guess. So these are sideways vented, the same way that the blade are sideways vented, which is the way that you would, deal with it with constrained space. The blade uses sideways venting and had always used sideways venting actually because the front part of the blade, if you actually look at cutaways, it's actually it doesn't allow for very much space. And obviously it has to be sealed away from the rest of the blade because you don't want all the bass inside the actual chamber of the blade to affect the unique. So the unique is actually sealed as its own separate pod in front of the blade. So the blade has sideways venting that is the same exact sideways venting used here. The sideways venting actually allows air to just escape sideways into infinity. So it is able to basically just like eliminate any rear ringing by not even allowing for any air to bounce back to begin with, because it just eliminates any rear air by sprawling it outward versus, the other uniques that had vented chambers would sprawl the air backward through a tube, which was, also not a wall. So it would also not allow for the waves to sprawl back forward. So either way, they're both very effective ways to deal with rear wall ringing. So why did the new generation, specifically the 12th generation Unique, have the matte tech or Meta tech when you already had it so that the air exiting the rear of the tweeter could either exit through the pole outward, backward, into a tapering pole that would then just be absorbed by a wad at the end, basically. And that was there was actually a little rubber point that went into the rear of the vent piece that would also help sprawl. So there was never actually any rear wall for the tweeter to actually bounce its rear wave up against. It would either go down through a vented tube and then hit a wad of basically foam, and besides that, the back of the tube was pointed. It actually had 2 points, so it was split kind of like a W. This uses the same mechanism again as the blade, where it, because of the space constraints, doesn't have the depth of having the ability to have a longer pole piece behind it. So it just sprawls the air sideways through foam, so that the air that goes that would actually be pressurizing behind the tweeter is free to just move its way sideways. So the air behind the tweeter doesn't make its way back forward anyway in this configuration, just like it doesn't on the blade. So we're gonna test how well this works, because why is it that KEF would then decide to take air that would otherwise be exiting sideways and actually contain it within a plastic disc that has a fixed number of ports? Why not have the air just leave and then have, more air just go back in as is needed? Why have it just be contained within a fixed number of the 54 pipes at all? So to see the effectiveness of this, we're gonna just go and keep raising the volume. As note, the reason I'm choosing the T1 is because this is probably the best example of why you would ever even want to have the technology like the MetaTech or any sort of a rear venting. This is the biggest dome tweeter that KEF has. I haven't looked into the commercial installations, but as far as regular KEF consumer, this tweeter is gigantic. And the reason why is because they want it to have a crossover down. The crossover is actually down to 1.8 kilohertz. Typically the crossover ranges between 2.2 up to like 2.7. The Blade, for instance, crosses over at 2.3. The LS series crosses over at 2.2, etc. This crosses over way down to 1.8. That's basically where Infinity crossed over their tweeters, because that clears it from the 2 through 3K brightness region, which is where our ears are most sensitive. And so when you get the crossover to be lower than between 2 and 3K, when you have any sort of like extraneous additional brightness in the room, for instance, like if you have the speakers near side wall, where the point when the crossover would happen, you'd have the woofer and the tweeter both playing at equal SPL, and the reflections from the wall on both sides would be basically as if you were to have 4 acoustic devices all going off at the same time and subbing, which would cause a unnatural boost in a brightened room. So that's why traditionally there were cases with things like the BBC dip, for instance, where for tighter spaces you would want to actually have it so that when you're going into the region between 2 and 3K, where ears are most sensitive, you'd want a slight dip there, because if the room is bright, when both speakers are going at where they would both be playing at their max at the same time, the reflections on the wall might actually cause some issues there, if you could kind of understand how that worked. By having an extra large tweeter on this thing, it's following the same exact lineage as what's called the Coda series. The Coda series actually predated the KEF UniQ, and it was their first attempt at making a very, very single point designed baffle where even the whole all of the sound sources came from the front. The woofer was in the front, the tweeter was in the front, and the port was even in the front. And there was actually a very distinctive baffle that actually connected them all together, so that all the sound sources, as they're moving around, would be aligned using the waveguides. This follows the same tradition by having it so that it's basically a fork, as if the UniQ never existed. And they're trying to make it sound as single point as possible, because as we all know, directional signals are most clear the higher you go up the frequency range. So if you have it so the tweeter is able to play down to 1.8, that's pretty damn directional. That gets all the directional frequencies pretty well covered, and then below 1.8, it's going to start sloping down, and then the woofer is going to take over from there, and the woofer is going to add the warmth, and by the time you get down to like 1.5K, it's still quite, still somewhat directional, and that's why they still have this little inner waveguide there. Just so whatever frequencies do happen to need the waveguide, and they also have the Z flex around too. So whatever frequencies do happen to need the waveguide, can use it. So the two waveguides between the tangerine waveguide and the one behind the one that the woofer is embedded in are designed so that it actually ends up sounding pretty damn unified. And if you've actually tried getting the C series, you'd be pretty surprised. It's cheaper than the UniQ, and I think that's why they make it. And it's a pretty damn decent speaker. I mean, if KEF never ever made the UniQ, and they just always just kept going forward with like their C series style designs, and the C series speakers was all they ever made, they would still be very successful, I think. It happens to actually be still a very, very good speaker that happens to still sound, it still happens to image extremely well, even though it's not single point. So what is essential about this thing? Not only, I'm going to list it again. The tweeter is the lowest crossover it's ever had. It's the largest tweeter. So that means it's generating the most force that a KEF tweeter would ever generate. And the tweeter being the largest means that it's much more susceptible to ringing than any other tweeter. Because, you know, the larger a dome is, the more susceptible it is, the less stable it is, you know? And it is just a dome tweeter after all. And it has, you know, the aid of its tangerine waveguide, but that's not going to stiffen the tweeter. It's still going to have to deal with, if there were any back wave ringing, it would actually affect this gigantic tweeter. What this thing doesn't have is a UniQ design. That means that the entire front baffle is sealed, and we're going to get to that later. So we're going to turn this thing up and see if there's any change in quality that would happen if the rear wave of the tweeter really was an issue. You would actually hear it as being a change in quality, a change in smoothness, and just, you know, an overall something happened there as we're changing the volume up, right? So we're basically stress testing it and trying to tease out any sort of issues this might have. Okay. Pumping it up. So you can see that I don't know if I hear any actual change in quality as I'm raising the volume. The rear venting actually seems like it's working pretty well. Let's try it again. So it's handling its highs pretty damn well, and you can hear her voice through it. And I would recommend to listen mostly to just one thing, like her voice, because we all know how voices sound, and we know when voices sound raspy. We even know when voices sound raspy from someone, you know, just having a dry voice like I do right now. So when we're raising the volume up, listen to the quality and see if it does actually become more raspy, more shouty, or anything. And so we'll get to the next piece. I'll pause. Oh, actually, I don't need to. So yeah, there's an issue with a lot of prior KEF speakers. Is the reason I brought it up. This is completely sealed in front because there isn't a Uniq. Uniqs prior to the 12th generation had a gap between the woofer and the tweeter. That gap, due to the fact that the tweeter and the woofer relied on each other as a synergistic driver, where the tweeter would use the woofer flare as a waveguide, drawing the air across the woofer flare. So whenever there was any chuffing out of the little gap between the woofer and the tweeter, it would cause just spontaneous little poofs of like weirdness, essentially. And a lot of times people would call it shoutiness, would be how they describe it, or raspiness, and that would be more likely to happen when you turn the volume up higher. But generally it's not a rule as far as how loud it is, it's how much actual pressure is inside the actual cavity at the time. So it's more a matter of how busy the actual piece is when you tend to hear it. And that, again, listen to the vocals, because that's where you'd actually hear, you know, if you want to have one thing as reference, that's what it would affect in a way that you would recognize the most. So since this thing is not relying on anything else other than itself, like the tweeter right here is actually just relying only on the tangerine waveguide and the baffle, and the woofer is a separate thing, so it's only working as its own separate unit. So the two are not working together in any way that where one would actually affect the other. There is no actual air leaking from any of these units, so it's effectively sealed, and there's no way that the tweeter and the woofer can actually interfere with each other in a way where any sort of weird air leakage would cause one to make the other one not work correctly. The same way that a Uniq, such as this, where you can see that there is a rim around here that actually has a gap, and the tweeter has a flare and then a flat portion right here. There's actually a classic XQ style woofer. There's a modded speaker, it's kind of a hybrid, but it's a XQ style woofer that is able to play up to 55 kilohertz. So that was pretty rad. But anyway, that's just random trivia. It uses a tangerine waveguide. It has a tweeter, so it equalizes the dome so that the outside of the dome is able to work as efficiently as the center of the dome. The fins cover about, I'd say, about 1/3 of the surface of the dome. From the front it looks pretty thin, but from the back you'd be able to see it. So the whole little horn right there allows for air to travel out of the flare, and then as it travels out from the flare, the woofer, as it's pistoning, actually allows for sound from the tweeter and the woofer to actually merge and be basically projected forward by this flattened portion right here. That's why the old classic Uniqs always had this flattened portion right before the flare. There's the outer rim, and then the flare, and then you have the horn, and then you have the tweeter. So the air goes like that, and ideally it goes here, and then the tweeter and the woofer both go like that. So that way it actually gets rid of the what's called the shotgun effect. That's where the sound is obviously coming from the tweeter, and when you stand in the middle, the tweeter is really loud. When you stand on the side, the tweeter's not as loud anymore. That's not what happens with Uniqs. They're designed specifically to eliminate the shotgun effect, and the way they do that is with this, by profiling the flare as a waveguide to the tweeter. So what you'll find that's interesting among all Uniqs is if you stand right in the front, you'll hear, you might actually hear the tweeter if you're this close, but you back away, you'll start hearing it disappear. But what's kind of cool is if you actually go sideways a little bit, and I can't do this with a camera, but you have to do this yourself. You'll hear sound coming from the tweeter, and as you move sideways, you start hearing the sound coming from here. And that's what the flare is for.